Long before the first historian wrote a single word, long before Rome raised its legions, and long before the great cities of Greece looked toward the sea, a silent kingdom was already rising beside a river in the desert. Tonight, we travel back to that kingdom. A land of golden crowns, hidden tombs, colossal temples, sacred animals, forgotten queens, and kings who believed they could defeat death itself. But the most remarkable thing about ancient Egypt was not the pyramids. It was not the treasure of Tutankhamun. It was not even the mystery of the mummies. It was endurance. For more than 3,000 years, while empires appeared and vanished around it, Egypt continued to return to the same river, the same gods, the same fields, and the same ancient promise that order could survive chaos, that life could return after death, and that every dawn was a victory over darkness. So settle in. Let the noise of the present begin to fade. Imagine the air cooling after sunset. Imagine a dark blue sky spreading above the desert, and the slow silver light of the moon touching the waters of the Nile. On one bank, reeds move softly in the night breeze. On the other, stone monuments wait in silence. Some have stood there for centuries. Others have not yet been built. And somewhere beyond the fields, beneath layers of sand and rock, a sealed chamber is waiting for a king who has not yet been born. This is the story of ancient Egypt, and it begins, as nearly everything in Egypt did, with the river. The Nile seems almost impossible when seen against the lands around it. To the east and west lie deserts, dry and severe, stretching toward distant horizons. Rain is rare. The sun can be relentless. Yet through this immense landscape, the Nile flows northward, carrying water across thousands of miles before spreading into a broad green delta and reaching the Mediterranean Sea. To the ancient Egyptians, this river was not simply a feature of the land. It was the source of life itself. Each year, waters from far to the south caused the Nile to rise. The river overflowed its banks and spread across the floodplain. When the water retreated, it left behind dark, fertile soil. In this rich earth, farmers planted grain, vegetables, flax, and fruit. The Egyptians called their cultivated country Kemet, the Black Land, after the dark soil left by the flood. Beyond it lay Deshret, the Red Land, the desert. The contrast was clear and powerful. Black earth meant life. Red sand meant danger, distance, and death. Yet the desert was not only an enemy. It also protected Egypt. Great stretches of dry land made invasion difficult. The deserts contained stone, minerals, and routes to distant trade. Their cliffs offered places for tombs, hidden away from the water and from the fields of the living. From the beginning, Egypt existed between opposites, river and desert, life and death, order and chaos. The annual flood gave the land a rhythm. People watched the river rise. They measured its waters. They waited for the fields to appear again. Their lives followed seasons connected to the Nile. The first was the season of flooding, when much of the farmland lay beneath water. The second was the season of planting and growth. The third was the season of harvest, when workers gathered the crops before the heat became too strong. This cycle shaped more than agriculture. It helped shape Egyptian ideas about time, kingship, religion, and the afterlife. If the river could return each year, perhaps life could also return. If the sun could disappear each evening and rise again each morning, perhaps death was not an ending, but a passage. Thousands of years before the pyramids, small communities lived along the Nile Valley. They hunted, fished, raised animals, and cultivated crops. Over time, villages grew larger. Crafts became more specialized. People made pottery, tools, jewelry, woven cloth, and objects of stone and ivory. Archaeologists have found evidence of different regional cultures in prehistoric Egypt. Their objects reveal changing styles and expanding trade networks. Goods traveled up and down the river. Ideas moved with them. The Nile was Egypt's great road. Boats could travel north with the current. They could travel south with the help of winds that often blew from the north. This made communication possible across a long and narrow country. Gradually, local rulers gained power. Small territories joined into larger ones. By the late 4th millennium before our era, two main regions had emerged. Upper Egypt was in the south, where the Nile ran through a narrow valley. Lower Egypt was in the north, in the broad delta. The names can sound reversed to a modern listener, but they followed the river. Upper Egypt was upstream. Lower Egypt was downstream. Each region had its own symbols and traditions. Upper Egypt was associated with a white crown. Lower Egypt with a red crown. At some point around 3100 BCE, these lands were united under a single ruler. Tradition later remembered a king named Menes as the unifier of Egypt. Archaeologists often connect this great political transformation with a ruler called Narmer, whose name appears on one of the most famous objects from early Egyptian history, the Narmer palette. On this carved stone, the king appears wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. He is larger than the people around him, a visual language that Egyptian artists would use for centuries. Size represented importance. The king stood above ordinary human beings. Whether the unification happened in one dramatic conquest or through a longer process is uncertain, but its meaning was clear. Egypt had become one kingdom. The king was the ruler of the two lands. And from that moment, unity became sacred. The Egyptian king would later be called Pharaoh, though that word originally referred to the royal palace, the Great House. Over time, it became a title for the ruler himself. The king was not simply a political leader. He stood between the human and divine worlds. He performed rituals, built temples, made offerings, led armies, and maintained Ma'at. Ma'at was one of the most important ideas in Egyptian civilization. It meant truth, balance, justice, harmony, and proper order. To the Egyptians, the universe was not automatically stable. Chaos always waited beyond the edge of order. The king's duty was to preserve balance, to keep the Nile flowing, the gods honored, the borders defended, and society in its proper form. Every successful harvest, every sunrise, and every peaceful year could be understood as evidence that Ma'at still held. The earliest kings were buried at places such as Abydos in Upper Egypt. Their tombs were not yet pyramids, but they already contained goods for the next life. Food, pottery, furniture, tools, and valuable objects accompanied the dead. The idea was simple but profound. Death did not erase identity. A king would continue to exist. He would need protection, nourishment, and ritual care. As the early dynasties developed, a new political center grew near the point where the Nile Valley opened into the delta. This city became known as Memphis. Its location helped rulers control both Upper and Lower Egypt. From Memphis, officials managed land, labor, taxation, storage, and construction. Scribes recorded goods and organized the growing state. Writing had already begun to appear in Egypt before unification, and it soon became one of the foundations of royal power. Egyptian hieroglyphs were both practical and sacred. They recorded names, offerings, titles, events, and prayers. A sign could represent a sound, a word, or an idea. The writing system was complex, beautiful, and closely connected to art. For ordinary administration, scribes also used faster forms of writing, including hieratic, written with ink on papyrus or other surfaces. To become a scribe was to enter a special world. Most Egyptians worked the land, but scribes could serve in temples, estates, workshops, military units, or the royal administration. They counted grain, copied letters, measured fields, recorded taxes, and preserved religious texts, a palette, brushes, black and red ink, and sheets of papyrus. Their influence was enormous. Without scribes, the kingdom could not function. And without their writing, much of ancient Egypt would have disappeared into silence. By the beginning of the Old Kingdom, around 2686 BCE, the Egyptian state had become powerful enough to attempt construction on a scale never seen before. The first great step came during the reign of King Djoser of the Third Dynasty. At Saqqara, near Memphis, Djoser's builders created a vast funerary complex. At its center rose a structure that changed architecture forever, the Step Pyramid. The man traditionally associated with its design was Imhotep, a high official who later became famous as a wise man and healer. Centuries after his death, Egyptians honored him almost as a divine figure. The Step Pyramid began as a mastaba, a low rectangular tomb. But the design expanded upward in stages until 6 great levels rose above the desert. For the first time, a monumental royal tomb was built primarily from stone. Around it stood courtyards, shrines, walls, passages, and ceremonial buildings. Some were designed not for everyday use, but for the king's eternal life. The complex was a palace for the dead. Djoser's body would rest below ground, while his spirit continued to participate in rituals above. The step pyramid transformed the Egyptian landscape. It also created a challenge for the kings who followed. How could they build something even greater? The answer came during the 4th dynasty. King Sneferu, father of Khufu, oversaw several major pyramid projects. His builders experimented with angle, weight, internal chambers, and stone construction. At Mitam, a pyramid may have suffered structural failure or later collapse. At Dashur, the bent pyramid changes angle partway up, possibly because the first slope proved too steep. Nearby, the red pyramid rose with a more stable design and smooth sides. These experiments mattered. They helped Egyptian engineers understand how to create a true pyramid. Then came Khufu. On the Giza Plateau, his workers built the Great Pyramid, the largest pyramid in Egypt and one of the most extraordinary structures ever created. Originally, it stood about 146 meters high. It was made from millions of stone blocks. Its sides were carefully aligned to the cardinal directions. Its outer surface was once covered with smooth, white limestone casing that would have reflected the sunlight. To a traveler approaching across the river, the pyramid must have seemed almost unreal. A mountain made by human hands. A stairway of stone rising toward the sky. For many centuries, it remained the tallest human-made structure in the world. The Great Pyramid has inspired endless speculation. Yet the strongest evidence shows that it was built by organized Egyptian labor forces, including skilled workers, craftsmen, administrators, quarrymen, haulers, and seasonal crews. The old image of countless enslaved people driven by whips is not supported by the best archaeological evidence. Near Giza, excavations have uncovered workers' settlements, bakeries, animal bones, tools, and graves. The people who built the pyramids lived in organized communities and received food, supplies, and medical care. This does not mean their work was easy. It was exhausting, dangerous, and highly demanding. But it was also part of a national project connected to religion and kingship. The Nile made the work possible. Stone could be transported by boat. Seasonal flooding brought laborers away from fields that could not be farmed at that time. Officials coordinated food, ropes, timber, copper tools, and vast amounts of human effort. The Great Pyramid was not built by magic. Its real story is more impressive. It was built through planning, skill, mathematics, discipline, and the labor of thousands of people whose names are mostly lost. After Khufu came Khafre, whose pyramid also rises at Giza. Because it stands on slightly higher ground and still preserves some casing stones near its top, it can appear taller, though it is smaller than Khufu's pyramid. Khafre's complex is associated with the Great Sphinx, the enormous statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king. The Sphinx faces east, toward the rising sun. Its exact meaning remains debated, but it was likely connected to royal power, divine protection, and solar worship. Later visitors would stand before it and wonder who had made it. The ancient Egyptians themselves sometimes looked back at older monuments with awe. To them, the Old Kingdom could become a distant age of great kings and sacred builders. The third major pyramid at Giza belonged to Menkaure. It was much smaller, but still part of a carefully designed funerary landscape. Each pyramid complex included temples, causeways, offering places, and smaller tombs for queens, officials, and royal family members. Giza was not only a cemetery. It was a place where the living continued to serve the dead. Priests brought offerings. Workers maintained buildings. Estates provided food and goods. The king's name was spoken in ritual. For the Egyptians, memory had power. To speak a name was to help preserve a life. To erase a name was a kind of second death. This is one reason royal names were carved into stone. Stone could outlast generations. Stone could resist time. And perhaps, the Egyptians hoped, stone could carry a human being into eternity. But the pyramids were only one part of Old Kingdom life. Beyond the royal monuments, millions of people lived in villages and towns along the river. Most were farmers. Their year followed the Nile. They prepared fields, planted seed, tended animals, repaired canals, and harvested grain. Wheat and barley were essential. Bread and beer formed the basic diet for many Egyptians. Egyptian beer was different from most modern beer. It could be thick, nourishing, and consumed by adults and children. Bread came in many forms, sometimes mixed with herbs, dates, or other ingredients. People also ate onions, garlic, lentils, fish, fruit, and vegetables. Wealthier households enjoyed more meat, wine, and imported goods. Homes were usually built from mud brick, made from Nile mud mixed with straw and dried in the sun. Stone was expensive and often reserved for temples and tombs, buildings meant to last forever. A village house might include a central room, storage areas, a roof used for sleeping in hot weather, and spaces for cooking and work. The streets could be dusty. Animals moved through settlements. Children played. Craftsmen shaped wood, metal, stone, leather, and clay. Egypt was grand, but it was also ordinary. It was a place of family arguments, market exchanges, laughter, illness, music, boredom, celebration, and work. Women in ancient Egypt had legal rights that were unusual in many other ancient societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, make contracts, bring cases to court, and seek divorce. Most political offices were held by men, and society remained unequal, but women were not legally invisible. Marriage was often treated as a practical and personal arrangement rather than a single formal religious ceremony. Love poems from later periods speak of desire and affection in vivid language. Children were valued deeply. Families hoped for sons and daughters who would care for them in old age and perform rituals after death. Infant mortality was high. Disease and injury were constant dangers. Yet people used medicine, prayer, amulets, and practical knowledge to protect themselves. Egyptian medical texts describe wounds, illnesses, treatments, and examinations. Some remedies were effective. Others mixed observation with magic. For the Egyptians, there was no sharp boundary between medicine and religion. A healer might clean and bandage a wound, prescribe herbs, and recite a protective spell. The body was physical, but illness could also be spiritual. The same mixture of practical knowledge and sacred belief shaped Egyptian views of death. The Egyptians did not imagine a single simple soul. A person was made of several elements. The Ka was a life force. That required nourishment. The Ba was often represented as a bird with a human head and could move between the worlds of the living and dead. The name preserved identity. The shadow also had significance, and the physical body provided a home that helped hold these elements together. This is why preservation mattered. If the body decayed completely, the dead person's existence might be threatened. Early burials in dry desert sand naturally preserved bodies. But as tombs became more complex and bodies were placed in chambers, natural preservation became less reliable. Over centuries, Egyptian embalmers developed the process now called mummification. The most elaborate form could take about 70 days. Internal organs were removed, treated, and preserved. The brain was often removed through the nose. The body was dried with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture. It was then wrapped in linen, with amulets placed between layers for protection. The heart was usually left inside the body because it was considered the center of thought, emotion, and moral character. Later, in the judgment of the dead, the heart would face a test. But for now, in the quiet workshops near the tombs, embalmers worked carefully. They covered the body with oils and resins. They wrapped fingers and toes. They spoke sacred words. They transformed a dead person into an eternal form. Mummification was not simply preservation. It was ritual rebirth. The dead became connected with Osiris, the god who had died and returned to life. According to one major myth, Osiris was a good king murdered by his brother Seth. His body was cut apart and scattered. His wife Isis searched for the pieces, restored him, and used her magic to bring him back long enough to conceive a son, Horus. Osiris then became ruler of the underworld. Horus grew up, fought Seth, and claimed the throne. This myth reflected Egyptian kingship. The living pharaoh was associated with Horus. The dead king became associated with Osiris. Death and succession were part of a sacred cycle. The kingdom could continue because the old king passed into the next world, and the new king restored order among the living. The old kingdom reached great heights, but no system lasts forever without strain. Over time, provincial governors gained more power. Royal resources became divided among temples, estates, and officials. Climate changes may have contributed to years of weak Nile floods. Food shortages and political conflict followed. By around 2181 BCE, central authority had weakened dramatically. Egypt entered what historians call the First Intermediate Period. For generations, rival rulers competed. Local leaders controlled different regions. Inscriptions describe hardship, disorder, and hunger, though some of these texts may have exaggerated chaos to praise the rulers who later restored unity. Even in times of crisis, life continued. People farmed, traded, married, worshipped, and buried their dead. But the image of a single divine king ruling a united land had been broken. The question was whether Egypt could be brought together again. The answer came from the south. At Thebes, rulers of the 11th dynasty expanded their control. Around 2055 BCE, King Mentuhotep II defeated his rivals and reunified the country. The Middle Kingdom. Later Egyptians remembered this period as a time of stability, literature, administration, and renewed royal strength. The capital eventually shifted to a city near the entrance to the Fayum region, allowing kings to control both the north and south more effectively. Middle Kingdom rulers strengthened borders, expanded agriculture, built fortresses, and sent expeditions for stone, gold, incense, and other valuable materials. To the south lay Nubia, a region of kingdoms, trade routes, and rich gold resources. Egypt's relationship with Nubia was complex. At times there was trade. At times war. At times Egyptian rulers controlled Nubian territory, and at other times powerful Nubian states challenged Egypt. Fortresses rose along the Nile in the south. Soldiers, officials, merchants, and interpreters moved through them. Egyptian influence spread, but Nubian cultures remained strong and distinctive. Farther east, expeditions crossed the desert toward the Red Sea. Ships traveled to the mysterious land of Punt, bringing incense, ebony, ivory, animal skins, and exotic goods. Punt was described as a distant, wealthy place. Its exact location remains uncertain, though it was probably somewhere in the region of the southern Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. The Middle Kingdom also produced some of Egypt's finest literature. Stories and teachings explored loyalty, leadership, exile, death, and the instability of fortune. One famous tale, the story of Sinuhe, follows a court official who flees Egypt after the death of a king. He lives abroad, gains wealth and honor, but still longs for home. In old age, he returns to Egypt, where he can be buried according to Egyptian tradition. The story carries a quiet emotional truth. A person could succeed in foreign lands and still feel incomplete without the soil, language, and rituals of home. To be buried in Egypt was to return to the order of the universe. The Middle Kingdom expanded access to the afterlife. In the Old Kingdom, the most elaborate royal texts and beliefs centered heavily on the king. Over time, more people gained access to funerary writings, coffins, and rituals that promised a blessed existence after death. Coffin texts covered the inside of wooden coffins with spells and guidance. The afterlife was becoming more personal. A noble, official, or prosperous family could hope to join Osiris, travel through the next world, and survive the dangers beyond the tomb. Yet even this renewed kingdom would eventually weaken. Royal authority fragmented. Competing dynasties appeared, and from the northeast came new groups of people whose arrival would transform Egypt once again. They were later called the Hyksos. Their name came from an Egyptian phrase meaning rulers of foreign lands. The Hyksos were not a single mysterious race that suddenly conquered Egypt in one moment. They were probably connected to populations from the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia who had entered the Nile Delta over time as migrants, traders, workers, and settlers. As central power weakened, Hyksos rulers established control over much of northern Egypt. Their capital was at Avaris in the eastern Delta. They adopted many Egyptian customs. They used Egyptian titles, worshipped Egyptian gods, and ruled through Egyptian institutions. But they also brought or popularized military technologies associated with Western Asia, including the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. In the south, native Egyptian rulers remained at Thebes. For a time, the land was divided. Then Theban kings began a war of reunification. Second Enratau may have died violently in this struggle. His mummy bears severe wounds to the head. His successors continued the fight. Kamose campaigned northward. Finally, around 1550 BCE, Ahmose I captured Avaris and drove Hyksos power out of the delta. Egypt was united again, but this time, its rulers had learned a lesson. The borders alone were not enough. Enemies could gather beyond them. Security required expansion. And so began the new kingdom, the Age of Empire. The new kingdom began with victory, but victory also changed the character of Egypt. Earlier kings had often focused on preserving the valley and controlling nearby regions. The rulers of the 18th dynasty looked farther outward. They built a professional military, campaigned deep into Nubia and Western Asia, and gathered tribute from foreign lands. Gold, cedarwood, horses, chariots, precious stones, incense, weapons, captives, and luxury goods flowed toward the royal court. Egypt was no longer only a protected river kingdom. It was becoming an international power. I restored temples damaged during the years of division and rewarded the families who had supported him. His reign created the foundations for generations of expansion. His successors pushed south into Nubia and north into the Levant. Egyptian garrisons and officials appeared far beyond the traditional borders of the Nile Valley. Thebes became the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Its local god, Ammonius, rose to extraordinary importance. Ammonius was joined with the sun god Ra and worshipped as Ammonius Ra, king of the gods. His great temple at Karnak expanded across the reigns of many pharaohs. Karnak was not a single building. It was a sacred city of pylons, courtyards, chapels, obelisks, statues, lakes, storerooms, and towering columns. Each king wanted to leave a mark there. Walls were covered with scenes of offerings, festivals, military victories, and divine approval. The temple employed priests, scribes, craftsmen, farmers, sailors, and laborers. It owned land and animals. It received wealth from across the empire. As the power of Egypt grew, so did the power of Ammonius' priesthood. The royal family remained closely connected to the god. During major festivals, Ammonius' image traveled in a sacred boat carried by priests. Crowds gathered as the procession moved from Karnak toward other temples. One of the greatest celebrations was the Opet festival. The images of Ammonius, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu journeyed from Karnak to Luxor Temple. Music played. Incense burned. Priests performed ceremonies hidden from ordinary eyes. For the people watching, the festival renewed the bond between God, king, and land. It also brought rare public celebration. There was food, drink, movement, noise, and color along the riverbanks. The New Kingdom pharaohs were buried differently from the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. Their tombs were cut deep into the cliffs of a dry valley west of Thebes, a place now called the Valley of the Kings. The location was isolated and protected. The tomb entrances could be hidden. The pyramids of earlier kings had announced the presence of royal treasure to the world. New Kingdom rulers hoped that secrecy would protect them. It did not always work. Most royal tombs were eventually robbed. But before the thieves came, teams of skilled workers spent years carving corridors, chambers, pillars, and burial halls into the rock. Artists covered the walls with texts and images describing the king's journey through the night. The underworld was not imagined as empty darkness. It was a landscape with gates, guardians, rivers, caverns, gods, monsters, and fields. The sun god traveled through it each night, facing danger before being reborn at dawn. The dead king joined this journey. Hour by hour, he passed through the darkness. At the deepest point of night came renewal. Then the eastern sky brightened. The sun rose, and the king rose with it. The workers who created these tombs lived in a special village now known as Deir el-Medina. They were among the most skilled and literate craftsmen in Egypt. They cut stone, plastered walls, drew designs, painted figures, and copied sacred texts. They were paid by the state in grain and other goods. Because many could read and write, they left behind an unusually rich record of ordinary life. We know about their arguments, debts, marriages, illnesses, absences from work, family disputes, and private prayers. A worker might miss a day because he was sick, because he was brewing beer, because he was caring for a relative, or because he had been bitten by a scorpion. These records bring ancient Egypt close. Behind the golden masks and royal monuments were people who worried about wages, complained about neighbors, borrowed tools, and tried to keep peace inside their families. The village had its own tombs, shrines, and local court. Workers decorated their private burial places with scenes that were often warmer and more personal than royal art. They showed families gathering, fields growing, and the deceased enjoying the next life. The afterlife was not only a realm of gods and judgment. It was also an ideal Egypt, a place where crops were abundant, families were reunited, and the dangers of illness and age had disappeared. Among the early rulers of the new kingdom was Thutmose I, a warrior king who campaigned far into Nubia and reached the Euphrates River in the north. His daughter would become one of the most remarkable rulers in Egyptian history. Her name was Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, and eventually the regent for a young king named Thutmose III. At first, she acted on behalf of the boy, but after several years, she took the full titles of kingship. She did not rule simply as a queen beside a pharaoh. She became the pharaoh. Egyptian royal tradition was deeply masculine. The king was associated with male gods and usually shown as a man. To express her authority, Hatshepsut's official images gradually changed. In some, she appeared as a woman wearing royal clothing. In others, she was shown with the traditional male body of a king and the ceremonial false beard. This was not necessarily an attempt to hide that she was female. Her inscriptions could still identify her with feminine language. Instead, the images placed her inside the ancient visual grammar of kingship. She had to appear not merely as a powerful woman, but as the eternal office of the pharaoh. Hatshepsut presented her rule as divinely approved. In temple reliefs, the god Ammonius chose her before birth. Her father publicly recognized her. The gods welcomed her. Her reign was prosperous and largely stable. She built widely and restored monuments. Her greatest surviving achievement is her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, set against the cliffs west of Thebes. Terraces rise toward the rock face. Colonnades create long lines of shadow and light. The temple seems both human-made and part of the mountain itself. Its walls record an expedition to the land of Punt. Egyptian ships traveled south along the Red Sea and returned with incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, animal skins, and other goods. The reliefs show foreign houses, landscapes, and people with unusual care. The expedition was more than trade. It was a statement that under Hatshepsut, Egypt was connected, wealthy, and favored by the gods. After her death, Thutmose III ruled alone. Years later, many of Hatshepsut's names and images were damaged or removed from monuments. The reason is still debated. Thutmose III may have wanted to strengthen the normal line of male succession, particularly for his own heir. The destruction was selective and appears to have begun late rather than immediately after her death. Whatever the motive, it did not erase her. Stone fragments, inscriptions, and statues survived. Her temple still stands beneath the cliffs. And the king who was once nearly removed from history became one of Egypt's most famous rulers. Thutmose III became a great military conqueror. He led repeated campaigns into the Levant and established Egyptian authority over a wide region. His most famous victory came at Megiddo. A coalition of local rulers had gathered against Egypt. To reach them, Thutmose faced a choice of routes. His officers warned him against the narrow and dangerous path through the hills. The king chose it anyway. The army passed through the difficult route and surprised its enemies. The battle ended in Egyptian victory, though the Egyptian soldiers paused to gather loot, allowing many opponents to escape into the fortified city. Megiddo then endured a long siege before surrendering. The king's annals at Karnak described the campaign in detail, presenting Thutmose as brave, decisive, and favored by Ammonius. For decades, Egypt's influence stretched from Nubia to northern Syria. Foreign princes sent children to the Egyptian court, where they learned the language and customs of the kingdom. When they returned home as rulers, Egypt hoped they would remain loyal. Diplomacy became as important as war. The great powers of the late Bronze Age exchanged letters, gifts, and royal brides. Egypt corresponded with rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hutti, and other states. Clay tablets found at Amarna preserve some of this international world. Kings addressed one another as brothers. They complained when gifts were too small. They negotiated marriages and demanded gold. Gold, one foreign ruler wrote in effect, was as plentiful as dust in Egypt. Perhaps this was flattery, but Nubian mines did make Egypt extraordinarily wealthy. At court, luxury reached new heights. Palaces had painted floors, decorated walls, gardens, pools, and storerooms filled with foreign goods. Officials were buried with fine furniture, jewelry, clothing, and carved objects. Yet most Egyptians remained close to the land. The empire's gold did not erase the daily labor of farmers. They still waited for the flood. They still counted grain. They still feared drought, illness, and taxation. The power of the pharaoh could seem limitless, but every temple and campaign depended on people carrying baskets, cutting stone, rowing boats, tending cattle, and harvesting fields. In the reign of Amenhotep III, Egypt reached a peak of wealth and international prestige. Amenhotep III ruled for nearly 4 decades. He built temples, statues, palaces, and monuments on a vast scale. At his mortuary temple in western Thebes stood 2 enormous seated statues now called the Colossi of Memnon. His court celebrated royal power with elaborate ceremony. Commemorative scarabs announced events such as royal marriages and great hunts. The king's wife, Queen Tai, held unusual prominence. Her name appeared in diplomatic correspondence, and foreign rulers recognized her influence. Amenhotep III was closely associated with solar divinity. Toward the end of his reign, he may have been treated almost as a living god. Then his son took the throne, and the old religious order began to shake. The new king was Amenhotep IV. At first, he followed traditional practice. But within a few years, he elevated the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, above the other gods. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He abandoned Thebes and built a new capital on a previously unsettled stretch of desert in Middle Egypt. The city was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, the site is known as Amarna. Boundary stones marked the sacred landscape. Palaces, temples, houses, workshops, and administrative buildings rose quickly. The temples of the Aten were unlike the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of many traditional gods. They were open to the sky, filled with altars exposed to sunlight. In art, the Aten appeared as a solar disk whose rays ended in small hands, sometimes offering the sign of life to the royal family. Akhenaten's religious program was radical. Traditional gods lost royal support. The name and image of Ammonius were attacked in many places. Temples were closed or deprived of resources. The king presented himself and his family as the unique intermediaries between humanity and the Aten. Whether this should be called true monotheism is debated. The evidence is complex. But there is no doubt that Akhenaten tried to reshape Egyptian religion around one supreme solar power and around his own royal household. The art of the period also changed. Akhenaten was shown with an elongated face, narrow chest, rounded belly, and broad hips. Members of the royal family appeared in intimate scenes, touching one another or holding their children beneath the rays of the Aten. For centuries, Egyptian royal art had emphasized timeless perfection. Amarna art could feel more immediate, fluid, and strange. Beside Akhenaten stood Queen Nefertiti. Her famous painted bust, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, has become one of the best-known faces from the ancient world. But Nefertiti was more than a symbol of beauty. She appeared prominently in religious and political scenes. In some images, she performed actions normally associated with the king, including striking enemies. Her exact fate is uncertain. She may have died before Akhenaten. She may have taken a new name. Some scholars have suggested that she briefly ruled as pharaoh, though the evidence remains debated. The mystery survives because the Amarna period ended in confusion. While Akhenaten focused on religious transformation, Egyptian influence abroad weakened in some areas. Letters from foreign vassals asked for military help. Rival powers expanded. At home, the new religion may have disrupted temple economies and angered powerful institutions. After roughly 17 years, Akhenaten died. His city did not survive him for long. A young king came to the throne. His original name was Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. Soon, his name changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. The old gods returned. The royal court left Akhenaten. Temples were restored. Official inscriptions blamed the previous religious crisis without always naming Akhenaten directly. Tutankhamun was probably around 9 years old when he became king. Powerful advisors guided the government. His reign lasted only about a decade. He died while still very young, perhaps around 19. The exact cause remains uncertain. Studies of his mummy have suggested health problems, injury, malaria, or a combination of factors, but no single explanation has been universally accepted. In his own time, Tutankhamun was not one of Egypt's greatest rulers. His tomb was small for a pharaoh. His reign was brief. His memory was later excluded from some official king lists because of his connection to the Amarna period. And that forgetting helped make him immortal. Because later builders did not honor his tomb, they also did not completely expose it. Debris from subsequent construction covered its entrance. Although thieves entered it in antiquity, the tomb was resealed and largely escaped the great wave of royal tomb robbery. More than 3,000 years later, in 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter and his team uncovered the entrance. When Carter looked through a small opening into the chamber, candlelight revealed strange animals, statues, gilded furniture, dismantled chariots, boxes, and gold. The tomb contained thousands of objects. At its heart lay nested shrines, stone sarcophagi, coffins, and the mummy of the young king wearing a golden mask. The discovery transformed Tutankhamun into the most famous pharaoh in the modern world. It also created stories of a curse after several people connected to the excavation died. Newspapers magnified coincidence into mystery. The so-called curse became part of popular culture, though there is no convincing evidence of a supernatural pattern. The truth was quieter. A forgotten king had survived because history passed over him. His obscurity protected what his power could not. After Tutankhamun, officials named I and then Horemheb took the throne. Horemheb had been a military commander. He worked to restore order and erase the legacy of Akhenaten. Because he had no surviving son to inherit the crown, he chose another military man as successor. That man became Ramesses I. A new dynasty began. The 19th dynasty produced some of Egypt's most famous kings, including Seti I and his son Ramesses II. Seti I campaigned in the Levant and built one of the most beautifully decorated tombs in the Valley of the Kings. He also constructed a magnificent temple at Abydos, with reliefs cut in delicate raised forms. His son would build on an even larger scale. Ramesses II came to the throne as a young man and ruled for about 66 years. During such a long reign, generations of Egyptians were born, lived, and died knowing no other king. His name appeared everywhere. He built temples, statues, gateways, and cities. He completed monuments begun by earlier rulers and sometimes placed his own inscriptions on older works. He moved the royal residence to a new capital in the eastern delta, Pharaohs, close to the military routes into Asia. His most celebrated battle took place near the city of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramesses marched north with several army divisions. Near Kadesh, Egyptian scouts captured men who falsely claimed that the Hittite army was far away. Ramesses advanced before all his forces had gathered. Then the trap closed. Hittite chariots crossed the river and attacked the unprepared Egyptian camp. For a moment, the pharaoh's army faced disaster. Egyptian inscriptions describe Ramesses standing almost alone, calling on Ammonius, then driving back the enemy through personal courage. The reality was probably less dramatic. Egyptian reinforcements arrived, and the battle ended without a decisive victory for either side. Kadesh remained outside Egyptian control. Yet Ramesses turned the event into one of the greatest pieces of royal propaganda in history. Temple walls showed the king towering above the battle, enemies falling before him, horses charging through chaos. The message was not that the campaign had been uncertain. The message was that the pharaoh could never truly be defeated. Years later, Egypt and the Hittites signed a peace treaty. Versions of the agreement survive in Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. Each side promised peace, mutual support, and the return of fugitives. The treaty is often described as one of the earliest surviving international peace agreements. Diplomacy succeeded where war had not. Ramesses later married a Hittite princess, sealing the new relationship. Of all his monuments, the temples at Abu Simbel are among the most dramatic. For colossal seated statues of the king guard the entrance to the larger temple, carved into a cliff in Nubia. Inside, halls and chambers lead toward a sanctuary deep within the rock. The temple proclaimed Egyptian power in the south, but it was also a sacred landscape of solar renewal and royal divinity. Nearby, a smaller temple honored the goddess Hathor and Ramesses' great royal wife, Nefertari. Nefertari was given exceptional status. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one of the most beautiful in Egypt. Its painted walls show her moving gracefully through the afterlife, meeting gods, and playing a sacred board game. The colors remain vivid. White clothing, golden skin, dark hair, red ribbons, green plants, and star-filled ceilings surround the queen on her eternal journey. Ramesses II had many wives and children. More than 100 sons and daughters have been attributed to him, though exact numbers are difficult to establish. He lived so long that many of his heirs died before he did. When he finally passed away, he was probably in his 90s, an extraordinary age for the ancient world. His mummy shows an elderly man with a strong profile and traces of reddish hair. To later Egyptians, Ramesses became an image of ideal kingship. Several later pharaohs took his name. But beneath the grandeur, the kingdom was changing. The eastern Mediterranean world entered a period of crisis around 1200 BCE. Great cities burned. Trade networks collapsed. Kingdoms fell. Drought, famine, internal rebellion, migration, and warfare may all have contributed. Egypt faced attacks from groups described in its records as the Sea Peoples. Their exact identities and origins remain debated. They were likely several different groups moving through the Mediterranean world rather than one united nation. During the reign of Ramesses III, Egypt fought major battles on land and sea. Reliefs at Medinet Habu show crowded ships, archers, warriors, and families traveling in carts. Egyptian forces claimed victory. The kingdom survived, but survival came at a cost. Resources were strained. Foreign possessions were lost. Prices rose. Royal authority weakened. Even the workers at Deir el-Medina, the people responsible for building the king's tomb, stopped work because their grain rations had not arrived. This event, during the reign of Ramesses III, is often called the first recorded labor strike in history. The workers did not simply rebel without purpose. They marched to temples and demanded the food they had been promised. Their complaint was direct. They were hungry. The state that built monuments for eternity could not reliably pay the people who carved them. This was a sign of deeper trouble. Ramesses III also survived, or perhaps only briefly survived, a conspiracy inside his own palace. Judicial papyri describe a plot involving members of the royal household, including a secondary wife who hoped to place her son on the throne. Modern examination of the king's mummy revealed a deep cut across his throat, strongly suggesting that the attack succeeded in killing him. The pharaoh who had defeated enemies abroad may have died through betrayal at home. After him, a series of rulers named Ramesses struggled to maintain control. Tomb robbery became widespread. Officials investigated thieves who entered royal burials, broke coffins, stripped mummies, and carried away gold. Eventually, priests moved many royal bodies from their original tombs and hid them in secret caches. Kings who had commanded armies and raised colossal statues were wrapped again, labeled, and placed together in hidden chambers for protection. Centuries later, these caches allowed archaeologists to recover the mummies of some of Egypt's greatest rulers. But at the time, the act was a confession. The old royal order could no longer defend its own dead. By around 1070 BCE, the new kingdom ended. Egypt divided once more. In the north, kings ruled from cities in the delta. In the south, the high priests of Ammonius held immense power at Thebes. Libyan military families, whose ancestors had settled in Egypt, rose into the ruling class. Several dynasties competed or governed different regions at the same time. Historians call this the Third Intermediate Period. It was politically fragmented, but it was not a cultural void. Temples remained active. Craftsmen continued to work. Egyptian religion adapted. New styles of coffins and burial developed. The story of Egypt was never simply rise, greatness, and fall. It was a long series of transformations. Power shifted, but the river continued. Then, from the south, came rulers who saw themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as restorers of ancient Egyptian tradition. They came from Kush, the powerful Nubian kingdom centered around Napata. For centuries, Nubia had interacted with Egypt through trade, war, colonization, and cultural exchange. Egyptian temples and ideas had taken root in parts of Nubia, but Kush developed its own political identity and traditions. In the 8th century BCE, the Kushite king Pi marched north into a divided Egypt. His victory inscription described his campaign and his devotion to Egyptian gods. Pi and his successors formed Egypt's 25th dynasty. They ruled a kingdom stretching from deep in Nubia to the Mediterranean. The Kushite pharaohs promoted temple building and looked back to older Egyptian forms. They revived artistic styles and royal customs. They also built pyramids in Nubia, though these were steeper and smaller than the great monuments of Giza. One of the best-known Kushite rulers was Taharqa, remembered in both Egyptian and biblical traditions. But the political world had changed. To the northeast, the Assyrian Empire was expanding with terrifying military power. Assyrian armies invaded Egypt in the 7th century BCE. They captured Memphis and eventually sacked Thebes. The Kushite rulers withdrew south. Once again, Egypt had been drawn into the struggle of larger empires. After the Assyrians, a native dynasty based at Sais in the western delta reunited much of the country. The Sate kings of the 26th dynasty encouraged trade, hired Greek and Carian soldiers, and looked back to the artistic traditions of the past. This was a period of revival. Old styles returned. Ancient texts were copied. Temples were restored. But Egypt was no longer isolated from the Mediterranean world. Greek merchants settled at places such as Naucratis. Foreign soldiers served the pharaoh. Trade connected Egypt to a rapidly changing network of cities and kingdoms. In 525 BCE, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded. Egypt became part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Persian rulers were recognized as pharaohs and governed through existing institutions, but resistance never disappeared. Egypt regained independence for a time, then fell again to Persia in the 4th century BCE. The final native Egyptian dynasty ended. Then, in 332 BCE, a young Macedonian conqueror entered Egypt. His name was Alexander. The Persian administration collapsed before him. Egyptians may have welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. He visited Memphis, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and was crowned as pharaoh. He also traveled across the western desert to the Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis. What happened inside the sanctuary is unknown. Ancient writers claim the oracle recognized him as the son of a god. For Alexander, who had already conquered much of the known world, the journey added divine mystery to military power. Near the Mediterranean coast, he chose the location for a new city. It would bear his name, Alexandria. Alexander left Egypt and never returned alive. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, still in his early 30s. His vast empire was divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt. Ptolemy eventually declared himself king and founded a dynasty that would rule for almost 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greek in origin, but they presented themselves as Egyptian pharaohs. They built temples in traditional style, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and appeared in reliefs wearing ancient crowns. At the same time, Greek became the language of the court and administration. Alexandria grew into one of the greatest cities of the ancient Mediterranean. It was unlike the old capitals of Memphis and Thebes. It faced the sea. Its streets followed a planned grid. Ships from across the Mediterranean filled its harbors. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, merchants, sailors, scholars, soldiers, and travelers lived side by side, though not always peacefully. On the island of Pharaohs stood a famous lighthouse, counted among the wonders of the ancient world. Its exact height is uncertain, but it guided ships toward the harbor for centuries. Alexandria also became famous for learning. The royal court supported the Mouseion, an institution dedicated to scholarship, and the Great Library of Alexandria. The library's size and destruction have become surrounded by legend. It probably declined through multiple events over time rather than disappearing in one single dramatic fire. But its ambition was extraordinary. Scholars gathered texts, compared manuscripts, studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, language, and literature. Eratosthenes estimated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Euclid's work shaped geometry. Physicians studied anatomy and the nervous system. Alexandria became a city where the knowledge of Egypt, Greece, the Near East, and the wider Mediterranean met. The Ptolemaic kingdom was wealthy, but it was also unstable. Royal family members often married siblings, following a practice that echoed both Macedonian dynastic strategy and Egyptian royal tradition. Court politics became violent. Brothers fought sisters. Mothers fought sons. Kings and queens were exiled, restored, or murdered. Behind the temple rituals stood a dynasty held together by ambition and fear. Egyptian farmers carried a heavy tax burden. Rebellions broke out in the countryside. Native leaders sometimes claimed the throne in Upper Egypt. The state remained powerful, but the distance between Alexandria and the Nile villages could feel immense. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Egypt's rulers could no longer ignore it. They borrowed money from Roman politicians, sought Roman military support, and fought over the throne with Roman help. Into this dangerous world was born Cleopatra VII. She came to power in 51 BCE, ruling first with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but ancient sources suggest she was unusual among her family because she learned to speak Egyptian. She was educated, politically skilled, and capable of presenting herself differently to different audiences. To Greeks, she was a Hellenistic queen. To Egyptians, she was a pharaoh and the living image of the goddess Isis. To Rome, she was both ally and threat. Her early reign quickly became a civil war. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria by her brother's advisors. Then Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt. Caesar had defeated his Roman rival Pompey, who fled to Egypt seeking safety. Instead, Pompey was murdered by men loyal to Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to please Caesar. It had the opposite effect. Caesar was reportedly appalled by the killing of a Roman statesman. He entered the dispute over Egypt's throne. Cleopatra needed to reach him without being captured by her enemies. Later tradition tells how she was secretly carried into Caesar's quarters wrapped in bedding or a sack. The exact details may have been embellished, but the meeting changed history. Cleopatra gained Caesar's support. War erupted in Alexandria. Ptolemy XIII died, probably drowning in the Nile while fleeing defeat. Cleopatra returned to the throne, now ruling with another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. She and Caesar became lovers. She gave birth to a son called Caesarion, whom she claimed was Caesar's child. Cleopatra later visited Rome, where she stayed during the final years of Caesar's life. Then, in 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated. Rome fell into another cycle of civil war. Cleopatra returned to Egypt and waited. After Caesar's death, power in the Roman world was divided among new leaders, including Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Antony controlled the eastern provinces and summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus. She arrived in theatrical splendor, sailing on a richly decorated vessel and presenting herself as a living goddess. Ancient writers described perfume drifting across the water, music, purple sails, and attendants dressed as mythological figures. The display was political theater. Cleopatra understood the power of an entrance. Antony and Cleopatra formed an alliance and became lovers. They had children together. For years, their relationship connected Roman military ambition with Egyptian wealth. Antony spent long periods in the east. Cleopatra supported his campaigns. In return, she gained territory and status. At a ceremony in Alexandria, Antony distributed eastern kingdoms and titles among Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was proclaimed the true son and heir of Julius Caesar. For Octavian, this was dangerous. His own claim to power rested on being Caesar's heir. Roman propaganda now turned Cleopatra into a symbol of foreign corruption. Octavian portrayed Antony as a Roman commander enslaved by an Eastern queen, abandoning his country for luxury and monarchy. Much of what later generations believed about Cleopatra came through hostile Roman sources. She was described as a seductress who conquered men through beauty. But her real power was political intelligence, language, wealth, and the ability to survive in a world controlled by rival kings and Roman generals. The conflict ended at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian's fleet faced the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra off the western coast of Greece. The battle was confused and hard-fought. At some point, Cleopatra's ships broke through and sailed away. Antony followed. Later writers treated his departure as an act of helpless devotion. The strategic reality may have been more complicated. perhaps an attempt to preserve part of the fleet and treasury. But the result was clear. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt. For months, they prepared for the final attack, negotiated, raised forces, and watched allies disappear. In 30 BCE, Octavian entered Alexandria. False news reached Antony that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was taken to the building where Cleopatra had shut herself away. According to ancient accounts, he was lifted through a window and died in her presence. Cleopatra was captured. Octavian intended to take her to Rome for his triumph, where defeated rulers were displayed before the crowd. She refused that ending. Cleopatra died in August of 30 BCE. The exact method remains uncertain. The famous story says she allowed an asp, perhaps an Egyptian, cobra, to bite her. Poison may have been used instead. Her attendants also died nearby. Octavian ordered Caesarion killed. Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs was over. But Egypt itself did not end. Under Roman rule, the Nile still flooded. Farmers still planted grain. Priests still served ancient temples. Mummies were still made. Traditional gods were still worshipped. Roman emperors appeared on temple walls dressed as pharaohs, even if they rarely visited the country. Egypt became one of Rome's most valuable provinces, especially as a source of grain. Ships carried harvests from Alexandria across the Mediterranean to feed the imperial capital. The Romans guarded Egypt carefully. Its wealth made it too important to leave in the hands of ambitious senators. Alexandria remained a center of trade and learning, but tensions between communities sometimes exploded into violence. The old Egyptian religion gradually changed. New forms of belief spread. The cults of Isis and Serapis traveled far beyond Egypt and found worshippers throughout the Roman world. Isis became especially popular. She was a mother, healer, protector of sailors, and mistress of magic. Temples dedicated to her appeared from Britain to the Black Sea. An Egyptian goddess had become international. Christianity also reached Egypt early. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era, Christian communities were growing. Egyptian deserts became home to monks and hermits seeking solitude, discipline, and closeness to God. The ancient temples did not vanish at once. For centuries, traditional religion and Christianity existed side by side, sometimes peacefully and sometimes in conflict. The ability to read hieroglyphs slowly disappeared. The last known dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 CE. The last known demotic inscription followed a few decades later. Priests who understood the old writing died without successors. The temples closed. The sacred signs became silent. For more than 1,000 years, people could still see the birds, eyes, snakes, crowns, seated gods, and mysterious figures carved across Egyptian monuments. But no one knew exactly what they said. The civilization that had written so much about memory had lost its voice. Yet the monuments remained. Travelers visited the pyramids. Medieval writers told stories about hidden treasure, ancient magic, and the wisdom of the pharaohs. Mummies were collected, traded, damaged, and sometimes ground into substances used as medicine in Europe. Obelisks were carried away to decorate foreign capitals. Temples stood half buried in sand. Villages grew around ancient ruins. The Nile continued to move past them all. Then, at the end of the 18th century, European interest in Egypt accelerated after Napoleon's military expedition brought soldiers, engineers, artists, and scholars into the country. The invasion failed politically, but the scholars recorded monuments, plants, animals, landscapes, and inscriptions in extraordinary detail. During this period, French soldiers discovered a dark stone near the town of Rashid, known in Europe as Rosetta. The Rosetta Stone carried the same decree in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. Because scholars could read Greek, the stone offered a path toward the lost language of ancient Egypt. The breakthrough came through years of competition and study. The French scholar Jean-François Champollion recognized that hieroglyphs could represent sounds as well as ideas. Using royal names and his knowledge of Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, he began to unlock the system. In 1822, Champollion announced his major discoveries. The carved signs spoke again. Names returned. Kings returned. Prayers, tax records, love poems, military boasts, legal complaints, medical instructions, jokes, and private letters emerged from silence. Ancient Egypt was no longer known only through Greek and Roman writers or through legends. Its people could once again be heard in their own words. Modern archaeology brought new knowledge, but it also came with exploitation. Foreign excavators removed statues, coffins, papyri, and treasures. Museums competed for spectacular objects. Local workers often received little credit. Tombs were cleared quickly, and important evidence was sometimes lost. Over time, methods improved. Egyptian scholars and archaeologists took greater leadership in studying and protecting their heritage. Today, research continues across the Nile Valley and Delta. New tombs, settlements, inscriptions, and burials are still found. Scientific techniques examine mummies, pigments, food remains, diseases, DNA, and ancient landscapes. But every answer creates another question. How exactly were certain monuments organized and built? What happened during poorly documented reigns? Where are the missing tombs of famous rulers? How many texts, villages, and ordinary lives remain beneath modern towns, fields, and desert sand? Ancient Egypt feels familiar because its symbols are everywhere. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the golden mask, the Eye of Horus, the profile of Nefertiti, the name of Cleopatra. But familiarity can hide how strange and distant the civilization truly was. The Egyptians lived in a world where gods inhabited temples, statues could receive offerings, names carried life, and the dead traveled with the sun through the night. Their civilization was not frozen for 3,000 years. It changed constantly. Languages shifted. Cities rose and declined. Foreign peoples settled in the valley. Gods merged and transformed. Royal power strengthened and collapsed. Egypt conquered others and was conquered in return. And yet certain patterns remained. The river, the cycle of seasons, the desire for order, the hope that death was not final. Perhaps that hope is the deepest thread running through Egyptian history. A farmer buried with a loaf of bread. A worker painting stars on a tomb ceiling. A queen building a temple beneath the cliffs. A king carving his name into stone. All were answering the same fear. What happens when a human life disappears? The Egyptian answer was to prepare. Preserve the body. Speak the name. Leave food. Write the spell. Build in stone. Remember, in the Book of the Dead, the deceased entered a hall of judgment. Before Osiris and a gathering of gods, the heart was weighed against the feather of Mot. If the heart was balanced, the person could continue into a blessed afterlife. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, a fearsome creature waited to consume it. The scene was moral as well as magical. A good life mattered. The dead declared that they had not stolen, murdered, cheated, or caused unnecessary suffering. These statements were idealized, but they reveal what Egyptians believed justice should look like. Even a pharaoh needed Mot. Power alone could not guarantee eternal life. And so, after our long journey, we return to the Nile at night. The great events begin to fade into the darkness. The armies are gone. The palace doors are closed. The voices of priests have fallen silent. The quarrymen have set down their tools. The last boat has crossed the river. Moonlight rests on the water. To the west, where the sun has disappeared, the desert holds the cities of the dead. Deep inside a tomb, painted stars cover the ceiling. A king lies beneath layers of linen and gold, surrounded by objects once touched by living hands. A chair, a cup, a pair of sandals, a board game, a small bundle of food for a journey no one could see. Outside, the night passes slowly. The Egyptians believed the sun was traveling through danger beneath the world. It moved through 12 hours of darkness, guided by gods, challenged by the serpent of chaos, renewed in secret. Then, just before dawn, the eastern sky began to change. Black became blue. Blue became gold. Birds stirred among the reeds. The first light touched the cliffs. The Nile reflected the rising sun. And once again, order defeated darkness. This happened every morning for the Egyptians. It has happened every morning since. The pyramids have lost their shining outer stone. Temples have fallen. Royal names have been damaged. Tombs have been emptied. The language of the pharaohs disappeared and returned. But the river still flows north. The desert still keeps its secrets. And the civilization that tried harder than any other to conquer time has, in one important way, succeeded. We still speak its names. Narmer, Djoser, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Cleopatra. We still enter their tombs in our imagination. We still stand beneath their columns. We still look at their faces and wonder who they were when no one was watching. History remembers their crowns, battles, and monuments. But beneath all of that were human beings looking at the same stars we see tonight. They loved their children. They feared illness. They worried about tomorrow. They mourned the dead. They hoped to be remembered. And perhaps that is why ancient Egypt remains so powerful. It is distant enough to feel like a dream, yet human enough to feel close. A kingdom of gods built by ordinary hands. A civilization obsessed with eternity, carried forward by a river that never stopped moving. So now, as the waters of the Nile continue quietly through the darkness, let the long procession of kings and queens pass into the distance. Let the temple music soften. Let the torchlight disappear along the stone walls. Let the desert wind cover the final footprints. The tomb is sealed. The stars remain above it, and the ancient kingdom sleeps. If these quiet journeys through the ancient world help you rest, subscribe and return for another long story from history. For now, close your eyes. The Nile is still flowing. The night is calm, and 3,000 years of ancient Egypt are drifting gently into silence.